I learned the hard way that a quiet life is something you have to fight for, even in a place designed for it. My wife, Clara, and I are detectives. Not the flashy, television kind, but the kind that spends most of their days drowning in paperwork and lukewarm coffee, trying to piece together the messy puzzles of other people's lives. We bought our house in Oak Creek Meadows precisely because it was boring. The brochure probably used words like serene and tranquil, which in real estate language means nothing interesting ever happens here. For two people who dealt with the worst of humanity for a living, boring was the ultimate luxury. We wanted a place where the biggest drama was whose turn it was to bring cookies to the annual block party. For the first 3 years, that's exactly what we got. The neighborhood was a patchwork of young families, empty nesters, and a few retirees who had been there since the foundations were poured. We knew our immediate neighbors well enough to borrow a cup of sugar or collect their mail when they were on vacation. The governing body, our homeowners association, was a sleepy, benign entity. The HOA president was a retired accountant named George who mostly just made sure the landscaping contract for the front entrance was renewed every year. Meetings were sparsely attended, held in the community clubhouse, and usually wrapped up in under 20 minutes. The biggest controversy I could remember from that time was a heated, 5-minute debate over whether the petunias should be pink or red that year. It was perfect. Then George and his wife sold their house and moved to Florida to be closer to their grandkids, and the age of tranquility came to an abrupt end. Her name was Brenda. She and her husband, a perpetually silent man who seemed to be made of beige flannel, moved into George's old house. Within a month, Brenda had attended her first HOA meeting. Within 2, she had volunteered for the board. Within 3, she had somehow leveraged the apathy of the other members to get herself elected president. It was a bloodless coup that most of us didn't even notice was happening until the first new batch of newsletters appeared in our mailboxes. Brenda was, to put it mildly, a woman who had found her calling a little too late in life. She had the unyielding certainty of a drill sergeant and the condescending smile of a kindergarten teacher correcting a child's grammar. She carried a clipboard everywhere, as if our quiet suburban streets were a series of inspection points requiring her constant vigilance. The newsletters, once a single sheet of paper announcing the date of the community yard sale, became multi-page manifestos filled with newly unearthed bylaws and friendly reminders that dripped with passive aggression. The changes started small, like a slow-moving infection. First, it was the trash cans. They had to be stored out of public view, not just on non-collection days, but at all times. This sent half the neighborhood scrambling to find space in their already cramped garages. Then came the mailbox decree. All mailboxes had to be a uniform shade of heritage black, a specific paint color only sold at a specialty store 40 minutes away. A few weeks later, a memo on lawn ornament regulation was distributed. Garden gnomes were expressly forbidden. Pink flamingos were grounds for an immediate fine. Anything deemed tacky or non-conforming by the Architectural Review Committee, which now consisted solely of Brenda, had to be removed. People grumbled, but it was easier to move a gnome than to fight City Hall, or in this case, Brenda's clipboard. Each new rule was a small, irritating stone in our collective shoe, not painful enough to stop and deal with, but enough to make the journey unpleasant. Clara and I watched this slow creep of tyranny with a kind of professional detachment. We'd seen this personality type before in witness statements and interrogation rooms. Brenda was a petty tyrant, a person with a deep-seated need for control who had finally been given a small kingdom to rule. We mostly ignored her, confident that our meticulously maintained property would keep us off her radar. We kept our lawn mowed, our hedges trimmed, and our trash cans hidden. We were model citizens of Brenda's new world order, and for a while, it worked. We were left alone. The peace was maintained, albeit a more fragile, tense version of it than before. The catalyst for our war wasn't a gnome or a mailbox, it was something far more practical. A neighboring town started experiencing a string of car break-ins and a few brazen daytime burglaries. The news spread through community Facebook groups and over backyard fences, bringing a low-grade hum of anxiety to our sleepy enclave. People started locking their doors more diligently and leaving their porch lights on all night. It was the main topic of conversation at the grocery store. Oak Creek Meadows, which had always felt like a protective bubble, suddenly felt a little more porous, a little more vulnerable. Clara and I weren't overly worried, but we were pragmatic. Our jobs had taught us that preparedness is the better part of valor. We decided to upgrade our exterior lighting. I spent a weekend installing a series of low-profile, motion-activated LED lights along our driveway and at the corners of the house. They were professional grade, the kind of thing you'd see at a commercial property, but they were discreet. When inactive, they were barely noticeable against the dark trim of the house. But when triggered, they flooded the area with clean, white light that was bright enough to read a newspaper by. It was a simple, effective deterrent. We felt better, and we figured that was the end of it. A few days later, Brenda made her move. Clara was in the front yard on a Saturday morning, tending to her rose bushes, when Brenda marched across the street, clipboard in hand. I was watching from the kitchen window, nursing a cup of coffee. I couldn't hear their words, but I could read the body language perfectly. Brenda was pointing a pen at our new lights, her posture rigid with indignation. Clara, to her credit, looked utterly relaxed, leaning on her trowel with a patient smile. Later, Clara came inside and told me about the conversation. Brenda had demanded to know what those unsightly industrial fixtures were. They are a violation of Section 4, Paragraph C of the Covenants, regarding non-standard exterior illumination, she had apparently declared, tapping her clipboard for emphasis. Clara, who has very little patience for bureaucratic nonsense, decided to have a little fun. "Oh, those," she said, with a dismissive wave of her gardening glove. "They're our new anti-burglar lights. State of the art. They can spot a criminal from 50 yards." It was the wrong thing to say to the right person. The phrase anti-burglar lights seemed to flip a switch in Brenda's brain. According to Clara, her eyes narrowed and her face tightened. "Anti-burglar," she repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. "Are you suggesting that Oak Creek Meadows is not a safe community? That sort of talk is detrimental to property values. We have standards to maintain. Those lights imply a level of crime that simply does not exist here." She then informed Clara that we were creating a climate of fear and that the lights had to be removed immediately. The official letter arrived 2 days later via certified mail, which was Brenda's preferred method of communication. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive legalese. It quoted the vague bylaw about harmonious and standard exterior aesthetics and formally demanded the removal of the unapproved fixtures within 7 days. Failure to comply, the letter stated, would result in a fine of $50 per day. It was signed, in an imperious, loopy script, "Brenda Miller, President, Oak Creek Meadows HOA." I read the letter and sighed. This was exactly the kind of tedious, pointless conflict we had moved here to avoid. My first instinct was to just take the lights down. It wasn't worth the headache. But Clara, who had the initial run-in with Brenda, was having none of it. "No," she said, her jaw set. "She doesn't get to do that. She doesn't get to tell us how to secure our own home because it offends her sense of harmony. This isn't about the lights, it's about control. If we give in on this, what's next? Is she going to tell us what color to paint our living room?" She was right, of course. This was a line in the sand. I tried to be reasonable first. I called Brenda. I explained that the lights were a discreet security measure, a response to the recent crime in the area. I pointed out that they weren't even visible during the day and only came on when someone approached the house at night. I tried to appeal to common sense. It was like trying to reason with a tidal wave. "The rules are perfectly clear," she said, her voice cold and smug. "The committee, by which she meant herself, has determined that your fixtures are non-compliant. If you wish to appeal, you may submit a formal request for the next quarterly meeting, which is in 3 months. In the meantime, the fines will accrue. Have a lovely day." She hung up. So, we didn't take the lights down. The 7-day grace period came and went. On the 8th day, another certified letter arrived. It was an invoice for $50. We threw it in a folder. The next day, another one came. And another. Brenda was nothing if not persistent. She had weaponized the postal service. We started to see her more often, too. A flicker of movement in her living room window as we pulled into our driveway. Her car driving slowly past our house at odd hours. It was escalating from annoying to genuinely unsettling. She wasn't just enforcing a rule, she was fixated. The conflict began to spill over and affect others, which is exactly what Brenda wanted. She saw our defiance as a challenge to her authority, and she needed to make an example of us. Her next target was Mr. Henderson, our neighbor to the left. He was a widower in his late 80s who had lived in his house for over 40 years. His wife had been an avid gardener, and he did his best to keep up her prize-winning rose bushes that lined his driveway, but his arthritis was making it difficult. Some of the branches had grown a little wild, extending a few inches over the public sidewalk. For 40 years, this had been a non-issue. But for Brenda, it was a new front in her war for total compliance. Mr. Henderson received a notice that his bushes were in violation of a rule about obstruction of public thoroughfares. He was fined $100 and ordered to trim them back immediately. He was distraught. He came over to our house, the violation letter trembling in his hand. "I don't understand," he said, his voice thin and reedy. "I've lived here for 40 years. No one's ever complained about Mary's roses. That was it for me. Harassing two able-bodied adults was one thing. Bullying an elderly man on a fixed income over a few rose branches was another. That weekend, I went over to Mr. Henderson's house with my electric hedge trimmer and spent an hour meticulously shaping the bushes. I trimmed them back a full foot from the sidewalk, making them neater and tidier than they had been in years. I even weeded the flower bed for him. He was so grateful he tried to pay me, which I refused. It felt good to do something decent and neighborly, a small act of rebellion against Brenda's sterile vision for the community. Of course, my good deed did not go unpunished. The very next day, a new letter arrived for us. This one was for performing unlicensed landscaping services on a neighboring property without prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. It came with another $50 fine. It was utterly absurd. There was no such rule. She was just making things up now, inventing violations to punish us for our insubordination and for siding with her chosen victim. The fines were starting to add up. Between the lights and my illicit hedge trimming, our bill was approaching $2,000. The certified letters were now arriving almost daily. Then came the one that really got our attention. It was a final notice of intent to file a lien. Brenda was threatening to put a legal claim on our property for the unpaid fines, a move that could seriously complicate our finances and our ability to ever sell the house. This had officially crossed the line from a neighborhood squabble into a serious legal threat. "All right," I said to Clara, holding the letter. "She's not going to stop. It's time to stop playing defense." We decided it was time to seek professional counsel. Our experience in the justice system had taught us one crucial lesson: when things get serious, you call a lawyer. You don't try to handle it yourself. We found a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. His name was Arthur Vance, a sharp, no-nonsense man in his 60s who had seen it all. We sat in his stuffy, book-lined office and laid out the whole story, complete with our growing stack of violation notices and invoices. Vance listened patiently, steepling his fingers as he reviewed the documents. When we were done, he leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long sigh. "Well," he said, "you've got yourselves a classic case of what I like to call petty tyrant syndrome. The good news is, you're not crazy. This is textbook harassment. The bad news is, the bylaws are so vaguely written that she can argue she's acting within the scope of her authority." He explained that fighting it head-on in court would be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. A judge might just say, "You agreed to the covenants when you bought the house," he warned. "So what do we do?" Clara asked, her frustration evident. "Just let her put a lien on our house." "No," Vance said, a glint in his eye. "We don't fight her on her turf. We find a different turf. An HOA board president has a fiduciary duty to the community. They are legally obligated to act in the best interest of the homeowners they represent. This woman's behavior, her selective enforcement, her vendettas. That's not in the community's best interest. You need leverage. You need to find something she's done, something she's hiding, that proves she has breached that duty. You're detectives. So go detect. Leaving Vance's office felt like a turning point. The frustration and anxiety that had been building for weeks began to recede, replaced by a cold, familiar sense of purpose. We finally had a clear objective. We weren't just fighting back against a bully anymore, we were opening an investigation. This was our world. Brenda had made a critical mistake. She thought she was dealing with a couple of stubborn homeowners. She had no idea she had picked a fight with two people who dismantled lies for a living. That night, we turned our dining room into a makeshift incident room. We pinned copies of the bylaws to a corkboard. We created a timeline of events. We laid out every piece of correspondence from Brenda. We treated her as the subject of a formal inquiry. Case file, The People versus Brenda Miller. We divided the labor. Clara, who is a whiz at digging through digital records and financial documents, would handle the HOA's official paperwork. My specialty is people, interviews, observation, and connecting disparate pieces of human behavior. I would handle the field work. Clara started by requesting official copies of the HOA's budget, meeting minutes, and financial statements for the past 2 years, which all homeowners are legally entitled to. Brenda couldn't refuse, though the packet of documents she eventually sent over was disorganized and clearly incomplete. It was a data dump, designed to be confusing. But for Clara, it was a treasure map. She spent hours at the kitchen table with a calculator, a highlighter, and a pot of coffee, cross-referencing invoices and expenditures, building a spreadsheet to track every dollar. Meanwhile, I started talking to our neighbors. I did it casually, striking up conversations while walking the dog or getting the mail. I never mentioned our own feud with Brenda. Instead, I would just ask, "How are you finding all the new rules?" The floodgates opened. People were frustrated and intimidated. The young family across the street had been fined because their toddler's plastic slide was visible from the road. An elderly woman down the block was told her wind chimes constituted a noise nuisance. Everyone had a story. They were all afraid of being targeted next, but no one felt powerful enough to speak up alone. They were isolated and compliant. I took careful notes after every conversation. Mr. Henderson became our first real ally. He was angry about how he'd been treated, and he had a long memory. He had served on the HOA board with George years ago. He told me how things used to be run, transparently and with a light touch. He also gave me a crucial piece of information. George kept meticulous records, he said. When he moved, he left 3 big boxes of old HOA files in the clubhouse storage closet. Said the new board might need them for reference. I wonder if Brenda even knows they're there. That was a potential goldmine. The next day, I used my own key to the community clubhouse, a privilege every homeowner had, and went straight to the storage closet in the back. Sure enough, tucked away behind a stack of folding chairs and some dusty holiday decorations, were 3 heavy bankers' boxes labeled HOA records. I loaded them into the back of my car and took them home. It felt slightly cloak and dagger, but we were well within our rights to review association records. That night, Clara and I stayed up late, poring over George's old files. It was mostly boring stuff, old landscaping invoices, insurance policies, minutes from meetings long past. But then Clara found something interesting. She was comparing the old budgets under George with the new ones under Brenda. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a line item. Landscaping services. Under George, the association paid Greenleaf landscapers about $1,200 a month. A consistent, reasonable fee. She then pulled out Brenda's most recent budget. "Now, look here. The vendor is a company called Brenda's Blooms, and the monthly fee is $3,000. More than double. That was a huge red flag. "Brenda's Blooms?" I said. "That's a little on the nose, don't you think?" Clara was already typing furiously on her laptop. A few minutes later, she had her answer. She had run a search on the state's corporate filings database. Got it, she said with a grim smile. Brenda's Blooms was incorporated 6 months ago. The registered agent and sole officer is listed as one Martin Miller. Her husband is named Robert, I said, confused. Exactly, she replied. Let me check something. She did another search, this time pulling up public property records and marriage licenses. Martin Miller, she announced triumphantly, is Brenda's brother-in-law. Robert's brother. This was it. This was the leverage Vance told us to find. It was classic self-dealing. Brenda had fired the old, reputable landscaping company and hired a brand new company owned by her relative, paying them more than double the previous rate for what was, by all accounts, inferior service. The common areas had never looked worse. She was using HOA funds, our money, to enrich her own family. It was a gross breach of her fiduciary duty. It was likely illegal. But we didn't stop there. We kept digging. We decided to do a full workup on Brenda and her family, just like we would for a major case. We ran background checks, searched civil court records, and dug into property histories. Most of it was clean. But then, while cross-referencing payments from the HOA bank statements, Clara noticed another anomaly. A recurring monthly payment was missing. It was a big one, made out to the association's insurance carrier. That's odd, she murmured, her brow furrowed. According to Georgia's records, the general liability insurance premium was paid every month via automatic withdrawal. But on Brenda's statements, it's just not there. The last payment was made 2 months after she took over. Then it stops. A cold dread washed over me. You don't think I started? There's one way to find out, she said. The next morning, Clara called the insurance company. Posing as an HOA board member inquiring about the policy details, she gave them the policy number from Georgia's old files. The agent put her on hold for a few minutes. When he came back on the line, his tone was formal. He said, I can confirm that policy number is no longer active. It was cancelled 4 months ago due to non-payment. Clara hung up the phone and looked at me, her eyes wide. This was infinitely worse than the landscaping scam. This was the nuclear option. Brenda, in her obsessive focus on petty violations and her scheme to funnel money to her brother-in-law, had neglected to pay the single most important bill the HOA had. She had allowed the community's general liability insurance to lapse. This meant that if someone, a child, a guest, a delivery driver, slipped and fell on a common area sidewalk, or if a tree on HOA property fell on a car, there was no insurance to cover it. The liability would fall directly on the homeowners themselves. Every single one of us could be sued personally. Our homes, our life savings, were completely exposed. Brenda hadn't just breached her duty, she had committed an act of catastrophic negligence that put the entire neighborhood at enormous financial risk. The landscaping deal was greedy. This was reckless. This was the kind of thing that destroyed communities. We now had everything we needed. The petty fines, the lien on our house, it all seemed so small in comparison. We had moved beyond a personal dispute. We had a duty to inform our neighbors and to remove this woman from power before she did any more damage. Our strategy shifted immediately. We were no longer on the defensive, trying to protect ourselves. We were now on the offensive, preparing to save the community from its own president. We spent the next few days preparing our case. Clara typed up a clear, concise summary of our findings, complete with copies of the corporate filings for Brenda's Blooms and bank statements showing the inflated payments. I requested a formal letter from the insurance company confirming the policy cancellation date and the reason. It arrived via express mail, a single, damning piece of paper. We didn't want to just release this information randomly. It had to be done in a way that was undeniable and public, leaving Brenda no room to wiggle out or spin the story. The perfect opportunity was just around the corner. An official HOA meeting notice arrived in the mail. Brenda was calling a special meeting. The agenda was short and to the point, to discuss member non-compliance and to vote on the placement of a property lien on the residence at 112 Oak Street, our address. She was planning to use a public meeting to humiliate us and finalize her victory. She had no idea she was actually planning her own execution. We spent the week before the meeting quietly canvassing. We went door to door, but only to a select few neighbors we felt we could trust, the ones who had expressed the most frustration with Brenda's reign. We visited Mr. Henderson first. We sat in his tidy living room and laid out the files on his coffee table. We showed him the landscaping invoices and the insurance cancellation letter. His face, already etched with the lines of age, grew grim. "I knew she was a bully," he said softly. "I didn't know she was a crook." He agreed to help us spread the word and ensure people showed up to the meeting. We repeated this process with half a dozen other families. The reaction was always the same: initial disbelief, followed by simmering anger. We weren't just fighting for our driveway lights anymore. We were fighting for everyone. By the time the night of the meeting arrived, we were confident that the room would be full. We had also taken one final precaution. Clara had made a call to a friend of hers in the white-collar crime division at the district attorney's office. We laid out the evidence for him. He was very interested. He agreed that the financial misconduct warranted a preliminary investigation and promised to have an investigator on standby. The community clubhouse was packed. I had never seen more than 10 people at an HOA meeting before, but on this night, there must have been close to 100. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Brenda and her two loyal board members, a nervous-looking man named Frank and a stern woman named Carol, sat at a folding table at the front of the room. Brenda looked triumphant. She surveyed the large crowd with a smug smile, clearly assuming everyone had turned out to watch her put the neighborhood rebels in their place. She had no idea they were a jury, and she was the one on trial. She opened the meeting with a bang of a small gavel. "Welcome, everyone. It's so good to see such a strong community turnout," she began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. She then launched into her prepared speech, a long, rambling monologue about the importance of rules, the sanctity of property values, and the dangers of nonconformity. She painted us as selfish troublemakers who believed we were above the law, a cancer that needed to be cut out for the health of the community. Finally, she arrived at the main event. "Therefore," she concluded, her voice rising, "the board proposes a vote to place a formal lien on the property at 112 Oak Street for failure to pay accumulated fines totaling $4,750. Do I have a motion?" Frank, the nervous board member, dutifully made the motion. Carol seconded it. "Is there any discussion?" Brenda asked, a shark-like smile on her face as she looked directly at me. This was my cue. I stood up and walked calmly to the front of the room, carrying a thin file folder. "Yes, Brenda, I have a few points of discussion," I said, my voice even and clear. The room fell silent. "I'm not going to talk about my driveway lights," I began. "Frankly, there are much more important issues facing this community. I'd like to talk about fiduciary duty." I saw a flicker of confusion in Brenda's eyes. This wasn't the angry, defensive speech she was expecting. I turned to the audience. "A fiduciary duty," I explained, "is a legal obligation for a person in a position of power, like an HOA president, to act in the best interest of the members they serve. It means they must be transparent, honest, and responsible with the community's money." I then opened the folder. "I'd like to start with the landscaping contract." I held up a copy of the invoice from Brenda's Blooms. "For the past 6 months, our community has been paying $3,000 a month to this company. The previous company charged less than half that." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I was curious about this new company, so I did a little research. I held up the corporate filing. It turns out Brenda's Blooms is owned by Martin Miller, Brenda's brother-in-law. The murmuring grew louder. Brenda's face had gone from smug to pale. That's a cost-saving measure," she stammered. "We're keeping the money in the community." The excuse was so flimsy it was laughable. People started shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Her two board members, Frank and Carol, were staring at her, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They clearly had not been informed of this arrangement. But I wasn't finished. "That's a serious breach of trust," I continued, my voice growing stronger. Using our money to enrich your own family is bad enough. But what's worse is what you weren't paying while you were busy writing checks to your brother-in-law. I held up the final piece of paper, the letter from the insurance company. This, I said, letting the word hang in the air, is a letter from our insurance carrier. It confirms that our community's general liability policy was cancelled for months ago for non-payment. The room went dead silent for a moment, and then it exploded. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated fury. People shot to their feet, shouting, "What? Is that true? Are you kidding me?" The chaos was immediate. I let the noise swell for a moment before raising my voice. "What this means," I yelled over the din, "is that for the last 4 months, every single one of us has been completely uninsured. If there was an accident on common property, we could all be sued. We could lose our homes. All because our president was too busy harassing people over garden gnomes and funneling our money to her family to pay the most important bill we have." Brenda was on her feet now, her face a mask of crimson rage. "Lies," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Those are forged documents. You're a liar. He's trying to distract you from the fact that he is the one who breaks the rules." But her authority was gone. The crowd wasn't listening to her anymore. They were looking at her with open contempt. Frank and Carol had pushed their chairs away from the table, physically distancing themselves from her. The collapse was total and absolute. Just then, as planned, the back door of the clubhouse opened. Clara, who had been waiting for her cue, stepped aside. 2 uniformed police officers walked in, followed by a man in a sharp suit holding a briefcase. He was the investigator from the district attorney's office. He walked calmly to the front, took the microphone from the table, and tapped it. "Good evening," he said, his voice cutting through the remaining noise. "My name is David Chen. I'm an investigator with the DA's office. We have received credible allegations of financial misconduct concerning the Oak Creek Meadows HOA. As of this moment, we are opening a formal investigation. All financial records and meeting minutes will be seized as evidence. The sight of law enforcement, of actual, real-world authority, solidified the end of Brenda's reign." She stared at the investigator, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, but no sound came out. Her little kingdom, built on a foundation of petty rules and intimidation, had crumbled to dust in the space of 10 minutes. The officers approached her, and one of them spoke to her in a low voice. She was not arrested that night, but she was escorted from the premises, a fallen tyrant stripped of her clipboard and her power. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The investigation by the DA's office laid everything bare. They found more than we did, evidence that Brenda had been using the HOA debit card for personal expenses, faking invoices, and skimming cash from the annual community yard sale fees. Faced with an ironclad case, she pleaded guilty to felony embezzlement and fraud. The judge was not amused by her actions. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation, ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, a figure that amounted to over $20,000, and was legally barred for life from ever serving on any board or in any position of financial trust. Her husband, Robert, who had been complicit in his silence, filed for divorce shortly after her conviction. For Clara and me, the victory was immediate and total. The interim board, hastily formed and led by a reluctant but determined Mr. Henderson, held an emergency session. Their first act was to unanimously vote to void all fines and legal threats against us. The lien that had started the whole thing vanished as if it had never existed. We were no longer rebels or troublemakers. Overnight, we became the neighborhood heroes. People would stop us on the street to thank us. We received casseroles, bottles of wine, and thank you cards. It was a little embarrassing, to be honest. We hadn't set out to lead a revolution, we just wanted to be left alone. Our anti-burglar lights, the source of the entire conflict, became a local landmark, a symbol of quiet defiance. With Brenda gone, a sense of profound relief washed over Oak Creek Meadows. The community had to reform itself from the ground up. Mr. Henderson, with the help of the DA's office and our lawyer, Arthur Vance, guided the process. They held a series of town hall meetings, not to dictate rules, but to listen. They rewrote the bylaws from scratch, stripping out all the vague, ambiguous language that Brenda had weaponized. The new rules were simple, clear, and focused on things that actually mattered, like safety and the structural integrity of the community's shared assets. The Architectural Review Committee was expanded to 5 elected members, ensuring no single person could ever wield that kind of power again. The first thing the new board did with its reconstituted authority was to secure a comprehensive new insurance policy. A collective sigh of relief was breathed across the entire subdivision. The neighborhood returned to a state of peace, but it was a different kind of peace than before. It wasn't born of apathy, but of shared experience and cooperation. A couple of years passed. Oak Creek Meadows thrived. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a genuine sense of community. People started decorating their yards again. Wind chimes reappeared. A family even put up a tasteful, non-threatening garden gnome, and no one said a word. Property values, which Brenda had been so obsessed with protecting, actually began to climb as word spread that ours was a well-managed, friendly, and drama-free place to live. The HOA meetings went back to being short, boring, and sparsely attended. It was perfect. We saw Brenda one last time, about a year after her sentencing. Clara and I were in a discount grocery store across town, picking up a few things. As we rounded the end of an aisle, I saw her. She was working as a cashier, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting polyester vest. She looked tired, diminished, and profoundly ordinary. The fire and self-righteousness that had defined her were gone, replaced by a weary resignation. Our eyes met for a brief second. I saw a flicker of recognition, then shame. She immediately looked down, focusing intently on scanning a can of beans for the customer in front of her. We didn't say anything. We just walked past and finished our shopping. There was no sense of triumph, no gloating. There was just a quiet, sad pity for a person whose life had been ruined by their own desperate need for control. It was a pathetic, but fitting, end to her story. Sometimes, when Clara and I are sitting on our back porch in the evenings, I think about the whole absurd ordeal. It started with a couple of lights and ended with a criminal conviction. It's a stark reminder of how easily petty tyranny can take root when good people are too busy or too intimidated to challenge it. Brenda's power was never real, it was an illusion built on our collective willingness to avoid a confrontation. When we finally pushed back, the whole rotten structure collapsed. We learned that a community isn't just a collection of houses, it's a shared responsibility. You can't just hope for a quiet life, sometimes, you have to stand up and fight for the principle of the thing, even if it's over something as silly as a driveway light. Our lives returned to the blissful boredom we had craved. Our work remained demanding, filled with the real-world problems of our city, but we could always come home to our peaceful sanctuary. As dusk settles on Oak Creek Meadows now, the streetlights hum to life, and here and there you can see the soft glow of other motion-activated security lights that some of our neighbors have since installed. And every night, as I pull into my driveway, my own lights click on, flooding the pavement with that clean, white light. They're no longer a symbol of defiance. They are just lights, doing their quiet, simple job. They are a promise of safety and a reminder that, finally, we are home, and we are at peace. And that peace feels earned.